Hello, I'm Jeff Sachs here. I hope you've been enjoying the course, and I hope you can see and hear me. So it's great to be together with you for a chat. We've had several questions come in already, and for those of you who are online, please don't hesitate to ask questions and add a chat. You've been looking at the question of globalization, and every day we have new evidence of the importance and uncertainties around the processes of globalization. We're in a time of tremendous uncertainty and structural change regarding globalization, partly because, as I emphasized in the course, the US-led era that prevailed after World War II and into the 1990s is coming to an end. And we have a new kind of geopolitics and a new kind of globalization taking shape, one that shows power much more dispersed, one that is also very much influenced by the rise of China, and one that is very much driven by the unprecedented expansion of information flows that are part of the information revolution. So we're in a new kind of geopolitics. We're also in a new kind of challenge because for the first time in world history, we really need to manage cooperatively for the sake of environmental survival and sustainability. We've always had collective action problems, especially around keeping the peace. But now we have big problems around protecting the natural environment on which we depend for our food supplies, for clean air and water, for the protection from new and emerging diseases, for the survival of the rest of biodiversity, which not only is a fundamental value in and of itself, but also is fundamentally important for our food supplies. We know that there are crises, for example, in the population abundance of pollinator species like bumblebees that pollinate the crops, and all of the pesticides and land use change, probably the global warming, maybe invasive species, and other changes that humanity is causing are leading to profound threats to the survival of the pollinators. So all of this is to say we're in a new era of globalization. Many of you have asked me important questions about that. Let me turn to the questions. From Damien. Damien asks about climate change. Shouldn't we be preparing to adapt to the inevitable climate change that's underway, in addition to mitigating climate change? And in a world in which global cooperation is very fragile, can we really hope to achieve true mitigation of climate change? Remember what the words mean. Mitigation signifies taking actions to reduce the human-induced climate change, mainly by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that humanity is causing, and mainly by reducing the amount of coal, oil, and gas that humanity is burning each year, and that then goes into the atmosphere and contributes to the global warming. Well, let me take up the climate change question in the following way. We've just had a meeting of the signatory countries to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And remember, the Paris Climate Agreement is an agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the UNFCCC is the governing framework convention. The Paris Climate Agreement, which was reached in 2015 and which went into force in 2016, is an instrument of the framework convention. Every year, the countries that are signatories, including, at least for the moment, the United States, because all 193 countries are signatories to the Framework Convention and to the Paris Climate Agreement, they meet. And this year they met in Bonn. It was the 23rd meeting of the parties of the conference, so it's called the Conference of the Parties, or COP23 or COP23. And not a lot came out of the meeting except some bad news. One part of the bad news is that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere jumped again enormously from 400 parts per million of CO2 to 403 parts per million. And that means that we're on a path that is unfortunately still leading to rapid increases of temperature. The other bad news related to that is that the amount of emissions caused by the use of energy and industrial processes went up again last year. For 3 years, 2014, 2015, and 2016, CO2 emissions had leveled off. But last year they rose again. And it seems that they rose in part because China's emissions of CO2, because of industrial processes, also rose again. So this comes to Damien's question: where are we in this process? We are not yet in a path of success. We're not even yet in a path of mitigation. In the Paris Climate Agreement, we agreed, all the nations of the world, to keep the rise of temperature to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Indeed, the agreement says to keep the rise of temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius. That means to not let the Earth's temperature rise compared to the temperature that prevailed at the start of the Industrial Revolution around the year 1800. Well, the temperature has already gone up by 1.1 degrees Celsius, and we've promised to keep it, the rise, to well below 2 degrees Celsius. But it's going to be extremely difficult to do so. In order to succeed in that, we have to end the burning of fossil fuel. And how fast? Well, the best estimates are that we have a 30-year left down ramp to go from the current amount of energy use with fossil fuels down to zero. 30 years brings us basically to the middle of the century. So from today till the middle of the century, we have to change the world's energy to one based on low carbon energy. How could this possibly be done? We have 1 billion automobiles on the road, all using petrol right now. Well, we know that we're going to need a very significant transformation of technology. Instead of a coal-fired power generating plant, one that produces electricity, we're going to need solar energy or wind energy or hydroelectric power or nuclear power. So we're going to have to change how we produce electricity, and we're going to have to change how we use energy. Right now, our automobiles, almost all of them, are based on the internal combustion engine, meaning that they use petroleum, gasoline in the tank. They're going to have to change to electric vehicles that are charged, where the batteries are recharged on a low carbon electricity grid. So we can see how to get to zero emissions. But then finally comes Damien's question. Are we really going to get there? Are we going to get there in time? This is a case where every country would need to contribute. And this is where the problems of free riding, or what's sometimes called the tragedy of the commons, comes in. Every country plays a role in getting the world's emissions down to zero, but each country says, I'll let the other ones do it, and I'll cheat. I won't make that extra effort, but let all the other countries do it. And of course, if every government takes that point of view, nobody ends up contributing to mitigation, and we end up signing documents like the Paris Climate Agreement without success. So we need group, collective action. We need all countries signing on. Now, here comes a challenge. We have Donald Trump, President of the United States. He is, in my opinion, a very irresponsible person with a very dangerous view. He says America first, as if the United States by itself could say we don't care about the climate and somehow get away with it. Of course, it would be outrageous, because if every country says the same thing, we're going to end up with a climate disaster. Now, why is Donald Trump pushing this position? Partly it may be his personal views and personal limitations, but I think that it is also the politics of the United States. And by that, I don't mean the views of the American people, but I mean the power of the oil industry in the United States. The big companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron, two of the big oil giants in America, or a company owned by two brothers, David and Charles Koch, called Koch Industries, are using their influence and their money to get politicians to not impose limits on their behavior. So ExxonMobil and Chevron and Koch Industries have paid a lot of money to Republican Party politicians so that those politicians side with the industry in opposing the phasing out of fossil fuels. This is, in my opinion, corruption of politics. It's a kind of evil. But in America, a lot of these contributions are legal. So companies pay for the campaigns of the politicians, and then the politicians turn around and say, I'm going to support the companies in their dealing. This kind of corruption could end up creating a massive crisis in the world. So again, to come back to Damien's question, we need a global action. We need all countries to participate. We need to break the corruption from powerful interest groups, especially coal, oil, and gas companies, so that we can get on with the transformation. A final point relative to the question. Damien says, shouldn't we prepare to adapt to climate change as well as to mitigate climate change? In other words, shouldn't we prepare to live better with some of the consequences of climate change, even as we try to mitigate the human-induced climate change? The answer is yes. And the reason is that we're already in the middle of climate change. Even if by some determination we're able to succeed in the Paris Climate Agreement, we still will have a large, significant, burdensome, dangerous amount of climate change occurring. So countries have to learn what is the effect of the ongoing climate change on your own countries. Is it drought? Is it flooding? Is it rising sea levels? Is it more storms? Is it more disease spread? Is it more forest fires? In other words, for your country, what are the main impacts that are being felt? Is it bad health coming from high temperatures and heat waves? And then it may be many of those. And if it's a large country like the United States, we could have floods in one part of the country, droughts in another part of the country, forest fires in one place, hurricanes in another place. But each country should map out the dangers that are confronted and then put in place investments to help protect against those dangers. Public health measures to protect older people, especially from heat waves, maybe irrigation or better water management to protect crops against droughts or heat waves, stronger coastal protection to protect regions from extreme storms or the kind of hurricanes that hit Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and other parts of the Caribbean this summer, because there will be more and more of those powerful storms in the future. So all of this is part of a sound climate program. And let me emphasize that countries have already promised to do this, though they're not too much succeeding in doing it. And under the Sustainable Development Goals, our framework for global cooperation under modern globalization, SDG 13 calls on all countries to take effective actions for both the mitigation and the adaptation to human-induced climate change. So that's a long answer to a very important question. I have several questions about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I just mentioned SDG 13. So let me say a few words about the Sustainable Development Goals. As we have discussed in class, and I'll mention right now, just like the Paris Climate Agreement was agreed by all 193 countries of the world, the so-called Agenda 2030 of the United Nations was agreed a few weeks before the Paris Climate Agreement, also by all 193 countries. And when you read Agenda 2030, which you can easily find online, within that Agenda 2030, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And they cover the three pillars of sustainable development: economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And several of you have asked the question about how to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the main point of achievement is to know that they are targets for the year 2030. They call on all governments to take effective investments to achieve those goals. They require that the goals be incorporated into national planning processes. Most governments have plans of some kind. Some countries, like China, have 5-year plans, and China's in its 13th 5-year plan right now. Other countries have 3-year plans, or they have vision documents. I believe that all countries should have these planning processes, especially to plan public investment spending, whether it's on roads or on low carbon energy or on protecting the coastlines, or to invest in public health and the education of the population. So the SDGs call on governments to develop effective plans and to work out investment strategies to achieve the SDGs. It's not a simple process. one question is how can policymakers understand the interconnections of the Sustainable Development Goals? This requires strong analysis. This requires a strong planning process. One of the points that I like to emphasize is that this requires a close cooperation between governments and universities. So if you are at a university, I strongly encourage the university to reach out to the mayor of the city, to reach out to the governor of the province or the state, to reach out to the national government and say, let's work on these sustainable development goals together. These goals are too complicated by themselves just for government to do, or just for business to do. These goals require a multi-stakeholder approach, meaning that government, the business sector, civil society, academia, and scientists all work together to design policies and strategies to achieve these goals by the year 2030. I'm quite impressed by China's commitment to the SDGs and to sustainable development in general. China has elaborate plans underway now, both to move to a low carbon energy system, so please move faster, and also to create this integrated development framework. China's also making major investments so that China can improve technologies like electric vehicles, or precision agriculture, or low carbon energy systems, or fast rail, electrified and running on a low carbon power generation system, in order to be able to make the transformation to sustainable development. China has a program called Made in China 2025, in which the government is committed to make important advances in technology in these areas. And I think that this will make a very major contribution. Especially remember the price, for example, of solar energy has come down by roughly a factor of 100 times. In other words, it's only 1/100th the cost per kilowatt hour now of solar energy compared to what it used to be a quarter century ago. And the big advance in this cost reduction has come from Chinese production technologies and all of the learning that has come from the large-scale Chinese production. Well, this relates to a question from Abdul Karim Ibrahim, who asks, Professor, what about the fact that Africa is lagging in technology? If China is advancing, what about Africa? What can Africa do to advance in technology? And I think that the idea of a major African investment in sustainable technology is a very, very good and important idea right now. Traditionally, Africa, unfortunately, because of the condition that African countries were left in at the end of the colonial period, for example, Africa's poverty, the need to extend even basic education, Africa has traditionally not put a lot of emphasis on science and technology policies. The level of government spending for research and development has been very, very small. This has to change. And I think the information technology age gives an added advantage for Africa in a couple of ways. One is now information can flow much faster than it did in the past. Even our Google Hangout this morning is an example of how information can be diffused and accelerated compared to the past. The MOOC that you have studied on globalization is an example of a new way to package information. So we have the possibility of spreading technology faster than ever before. There's another point, though, very closely related, and that is that the same technologies that are allowing us to have a Google Hangout this morning, or that allowed us to have the MOOC, are technologies that can be used in every key sector of an economy. Think of the electronic payments that have sprouted all over Africa in the last 10 years, starting with the most famous, perhaps of all of them, the M-Pesa, or M-Wallet, mobile money of Kenya and East Africa. Well, now there are electronic payment systems operating all over Africa, even in places that really don't even have a physical bank anywhere in the village or near the community. No ATM machines for cash, but payments are still being made electronically. That same new breakthrough could be used in healthcare. There are a lot of experiments underway right now regarding telemedicine, where even somebody has an X-ray, perhaps from a portable X-ray machine, or a sonogram, even on an application that's basically fits onto a mobile phone. And the imaging that comes out of that is transmitted, of course, electronically, and can be read by a doctor halfway around the world. And so telemedicine is a great advance that allows for economizing on having radiologists or other kinds of doctors nearby. Education can be tele-education, of course, whether it's through MOOCs or by collecting classrooms together in video, or by having the kind of Google Hangouts that we're having, or tele-mentoring or tele-tutoring that is possible, that can help students by teaching them even one-on-one from hundreds of kilometers or thousands of kilometers away. There are technological advances similarly in agriculture. It's possible to use satellite data to know where to put fertilizer and to do precision agriculture. It's possible, of course, to use satellites for conservation purposes, because with the satellite data, we can monitor illegal logging or illegal fishing or other practices in order to support the conservation process. Finally, let me say that universities could partner with other universities to say, here we are on the ground, maybe in Kigali, Rwanda, and we have a lot of good students, but we would really like to partner with another international university to help introduce a new curriculum in information technology. And an example of this is the new campus in Kigali of Carnegie Mellon University, which is a Pittsburgh, United States, great university for information technology. And Carnegie Mellon has opened a campus in Rwanda, and it's teaching dozens and dozens of really, really smart new information technology engineers who are going to be playing a very big role in Africa's development. So I think that this is a tremendous potential, and we're no longer in the age where we said, oh, leave technology to the rich countries and the poor countries don't have to pay too much attention about that. Let me take a question from Monica and Mus Ambique Espacio de Memorias, I think, but I'm not sure I have the spelling or pronunciation right. How do I see the role of cultural and religious institutions in contributing towards sustainable development goals and humane development? This is a very big question, but let me point out as one example of such a contribution. Pope Francis of the Catholic Church issued a very powerful encyclical in the year 2015 called Laudato Si, Laudato, and then new word SI apostrophe. And this is an encyclical about climate change, about the dangers of environmental threats, about globalization, and about sustainable development. It's a beautiful encyclical showing how the Catholic religion teachings and philosophy can be harnessed to help make a sustainable world. And Pope Francis, when he wrote Laudato Si, said this is not just for Catholic believers, this is a discussion I, as Pope, would like to have with the whole world community. So it's something that I would like everybody to look at. It's an example of how a great religious tradition and moral tradition can be harnessed right now for the good of sustainable development. And there are many, many examples of religious leaders, Muslim and Jewish and Buddhist and Hindu and Anglican and other leaders speaking out, saying that sustainable development is a moral commitment, not only a technical challenge, not only a political challenge, not only a diplomatic challenge, but also a major moral commitment as well. And so we need the religious leaders speaking out, telling their followers and the congregations how to be engaged, helping to spread the news about the dangers as well as the opportunities regarding sustainable development, helping to spread the idea that when companies fight against sustainable development, like ExxonMobil or Chevron or Koch Industries that I mentioned earlier, this is a kind of corporate evil that needs to be brought under control. And so I do believe that this is a very important role. What about religious conflict, interreligious conflict, where Christians are fighting Muslims or Hindus are fighting Buddhists or Buddhists are fighting Muslims? We're seeing inter-ethnic violence all over the world. When I speak with religious leaders about that inter-ethnic violence, the religious leaders often say to me, don't misunderstand. It's not coming from the religion. It's coming from the politicians that are using our religion in the wrong way. They're committing evil in the name of religion. There's a lot of truth to this, and please pay attention to it and speak out about it, because a lot of the violence committed in the name of religion is not coming from the religions themselves. It's not coming from the religious leaders. It's coming from politicians who are dangerously misquoting and misusing religions for their own political purposes, to rally their forces, rally their supporters, win power. But the violence is undertaken in the name of religion. And I believe that the possibilities for interreligious peace and cooperation are really very powerful. But sometimes it's the politicians that have gotten in the way. Let me conclude with a couple of questions about the colonial legacy. There's a question from Donna about the colonial legacy of Ireland, which of course was a colony of Britain until the 20th century. Ireland was poor. it had largely in the 19th century a monoculture, meaning producing overwhelmingly one crop, which was potatoes. This led to poor health and to a kind of extreme vulnerability. If the potato was subject to a pest or a blight that led to crop failure, then there would be a human disaster. And that's exactly what happened in the Irish potato famine of the late 1840s, when a blight attacked the potato production, and many people starved. Many people died of disease and of diseases related to hunger. And of course, millions of people left Ireland and formed a diaspora, for example, in my own country, in the United States, where we have as many as 30 million Irish American descendants now. So what happened to Ireland? Because here the Industrial Revolution started in England, right nearby. And I think it is an example where discrimination and imperial power limited definitely Ireland's development in the 19th century. Ireland industrialized a little bit in the north of Ireland, around Belfast, which today is Northern Ireland. But in the south of Ireland, and today the state of Ireland, the independent country of Ireland, Ireland remained largely agricultural and generally very poor. If you trace Ireland's economic development, it's not as if there was no progress, but first there were disasters like the Irish famine, not treated very nicely by the British. And there was some progress, but Ireland remained always at approximately half the per capita income level of its richer neighbor, Great Britain. And so Ireland was always lagging behind, always more agrarian, always less developed. This has changed significantly in the last 50 years, and especially in the last quarter century, because Ireland took policies, especially an outward-oriented, export-led growth policy as a member of the European Union, and a low tax policy to say to international investors, come invest in Ireland. We can be a production platform or a sales platform for exports to the rest of the European Union. And this led to quite rapid growth in Ireland. There were several downsides, however, to this strategy as well. One is that it led to financial speculation, and Ireland experienced a big financial crisis in 2008 when the whole world had its financial crisis, and Ireland is still recovering from that. Second, it's led to a lot of tax evasion. And so Ireland created itself or recreated itself as a kind of tax haven. And this has created a lot of abuses in avoiding or evading taxes. And third, it's led to a lot of income inequality in Ireland as well, so that some parts of Ireland have achieved quite rapid economic growth, but other parts of Ireland have seen stagnant earnings, and the result has been a widening of the income inequality. So Ireland's development model has been relatively more successful, certainly post-colonial period, and in the most recent generation, but with lots of problems still remaining. And now Brexit is a big challenge for Ireland, because if the United Kingdom leaves the EU, that's either going to create a sharp economic divide between Ireland and Britain, or it could create some new barriers between Ireland and the rest of the EU. Even the physical border between Ireland and Northern Ireland becomes a big problem. Right now, it's a completely open border. But when the UK leaves the EU under Brexit, there are some demands that a hard border will need to be put in place. And this would be awful from Ireland's point of view. So many, many problems are going to come from the Brexit decision, and those problems will spill over to Ireland as well. Well, we've reached the end of our time. There were more questions coming. I apologize for those that I did not get a chance to attend to. But for all of you who have been students in this class, first, thank you for taking this course on globalization. Please remain students all your lives, in the sense of keep your eyes open, keep learning, keep studying, keep taking online courses, because they are ways for all of us to augment our knowledge and education. Keep your eyes open on globalization, because the world is very interconnected, and ideas like America First of Donald Trump are terrible ideas that are not only selfish, but very, very naive, because we need global cooperation in order to achieve the best of humanity, and especially in our context, to achieve sustainable development. Thank you all for being part of this course, and thank you for being part of today's Google Hangout. And stay in contact, please, so that we can continue to be working together and brainstorming together on the challenges of sustainable development. Thanks to all of you, and take care. Bye-bye.